As the dust settles on budget week, two competing visions are clear. The government's throwing billions at growing a green tech future. Peter Dutton wants to go back to basics and reckons cutting immigration is what Australia really needs. It's a sharp divide and the contest will determine the shape of the economy. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. In the days following Jim Chalmers' third budget, debate centred on the immediate cost of living relief. $300 in energy bill relief for all households and another increase in spending. It had economists worried about pushing up inflation. But the real political debate is over the longer term measures in this budget, the billions set aside to kickstart hydrogen production and critical minerals processing in Australia. Peter Dutton calls it billions for billionaires. He argues these industries should stand on their own feet. Instead, the opposition leader used his budget reply to promise a cut in migration to help solve the nation's housing and congestion woes.
The Treasurer is ready to deliver his federal budget this evening, forecasting a $9.3 billion surplus.
Looking forward to telling the world about it.
No pressure.
Thanks very much, guys.
The Treasurer is under pressure to rein in spending and help lower inflation. He says he's struck the right balance.
Can you give Bunny a name? Why don't we call the Bunny Budget?
Budget Bunny.
And I call the Treasurer.
Speaker, the number one priority of this government and this budget is helping Australians with the cost of living.
Well, last night's big announcement was that from July 1, all households will get a rebate on their electricity bills.
A big measure, and the Treasurer is unashamedly saying it's going to apply to all Australians, no matter how much they earn.
$300 for every Australian doesn't exactly pass the pub test. I'm not sure Twiggy needs his power bill rebate.
Well, he's not the focus of the program here.
This is a band-aid on a bullet wound, frankly.
My key hope of the budget was that it wouldn't poke the inflationary bear. My fear now is that I think it has.
The more serious political debate is set to focus on the government's plans to reshape the Australian economy for the net zero future.
This is about Australia seizing the opportunities in the transformation in the global economy.
Why is the Prime Minister spending $13.7 billion on tax credits for billionaires at a time when ordinary Australian battlers are struggling to make ends meet?
Spare us the faux class warfare.
Peter Dutton is to announce tonight a coalition policy of a massive immigration cut.
The coalition can free up more houses for Australians because this Labor government has set our country on a very dangerous course.
Well, that was pretty dark, wasn't it?
You have been called the Darth Vader of politics by the government this morning.
I just wonder if he knows how many foreigners bought houses in the last 2 years. Over to you, Pete.
Well, Bill, back to you. I mean, how did you go in the 2019 election? So, as an opposition
did you
leader,
say you don't like personal attacks when you can't? Zinger.
Budget week over and the attack lines are hardening.
Whether or not it is appealing to people is for the pundits and the commentators to determine.
And my guest this morning is the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. First, let's check what's making news. Members of an army unit that packs parachutes tested positive to illicit drugs just days before Special Forces soldier Jack Fitzgibbon was killed in a training jump. ABC Defence correspondent Andrew Green has this exclusive story this morning revealing 6 soldiers serving at RAF Base Richmond failed drug screening and are now facing possible expulsion. A senior army figure insists the riggers who prepared the chute for Lance Corporal Fitzgibbon, the son of former Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon, were drug tested and tested negative. Pro-Palestinian demonstrators stormed Victoria's State Labor Conference yesterday in Melbourne, where the Prime Minister and Premier were both in attendance. Premier Jacinta Allen was hurried away from the mob. Federal Labor MP Daniel Molino was shoved by the crowd, and a security guard fell when protesters pushed past him. And finally, in the 9 newspapers, more than a quarter of Palestinians on temporary visas in Australia have applied for permanent asylum. Australia has issued more than 2,000 visitor visas to Palestinians since the invasion of Gaza began. They can spend up to a year here on the visa but aren't allowed to work or access Medicare. According to the newspaper, the asylum claims are the first from Palestinians since at least 2009. Well, at some point in the next 12 months, an election will be held, and the contest has now become much clearer. Peter Dutton is going for a simple solution: cut immigration to solve the housing crisis. He knows this will have some raw appeal, even if experts and industry figures argue it won't work. Labor, meanwhile, might have a more complicated pitch about its vision for a green manufacturing future, but it is banking on experts, industry figures and voters backing the plan, particularly in Western Australia, where even local Liberals are on board. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Laura Tingle, Phil Coorey and Peter Hartcher. Very good morning to all of you at the end of a busy budget week. There's lots of detail I want to explore, but we might just start with some big picture thoughts. Laura, on the budget itself, what did we learn about the government's plans for the future, and I suppose its plans for the role and size of government as well?
So the government's basically had two messages in the budget. One of them was that you're getting $300 on top of your tax cuts, and that implicit in that is the strategy that there will be a mechanical drop in inflation, which will lead the way for the only price that I think, or the only price signals that matters to voters, which is whether interest rates are cut by the Reserve Bank. And then there's this future made in Australia idea. Now, I think in a lot of the somewhat hysterical coverage of the budget, there's two things that have been overlooked. One of them is that the economy is forecast to barely have a pulse over the next couple of years, and that changes the dynamics of whether you spend, save, whatever. The government has delivered a surplus. There's sort of more sort of hysterical hand calls about too much spending, particularly from, dare one say, the Financial Review this week, overlooks a couple of things. One of them is that the deficit as a proportion of the GDP is basically at worst going to be sort of about the middle of the range of what it was in the best of the years of the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments. And I think a really important point, and then I'll shut up, is which just really made me think about these things. People are talking about spending being at record levels of 26%. Well, look, they've been up at 25.5%, once again in the former government quite a lot, and I'm not talking about pandemic years. And at some point we actually have to go, oh, we're actually starting to spend, or aiming to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence in the future.
Yeah, that's part of it.
It was 1.5% a decade ago. At some point, that means spending's going to have to go up.
Yeah, defence, we know the list of things that spending's growing on, but just to, I guess, nail down this spending issue, have a look at the figures. What you can see there in the yellow line is spending as a percentage of GDP over the years, over the decades. The spike there is obviously COVID, where it really shot up. The red dotted line through the middle is the average of spending. So once you take out that COVID spike, that's the average, that red line. And that purple wiggle at the end there is where it's forecast to go over the next 4 years. So it is higher. Spending is growing. Phil, is that a problem?
Well, pardon me, sorry. Well, it can be. I mean, if you're banking in structural spending into deficit budgets, it's always a problem. You were a critic of the Howard government, Laura. They used to always put structural deficits into what were surplus budgets. We saw in this budget they're putting structural spending into forecast deficits for the next 10 years. That's not to quibble with the nobility of the measures, but I remember Katie Gallagher saying we'll do paid parental leave superannuation when we can afford it. Well, we're now rolling it out into 10 years of deficits.
Sort of like tax cuts.
Yeah, sort of. Okay, defence, tax cuts, defence, spending, massive wage rises for the aged care sector.
There's also buried in the budget a huge nearly $6.5 billion payout for military compensation for military veterans. There's a lot of this is hard.
But there's a lot of ongoing stuff in there, David. So that's what I'm saying. Yeah. And you can't. And I'm not saying these are bad things, but they have to be. I mean, aged care workers, childcare workers, saints, all of them. Have had people in my family through both ends of that system. And you'd give them $1 million if you could, but that has to be paid for. And so all I'm saying is, since the budget, as the budget said, since December, they've taken $32 billion in new spending decisions just since December, offset by $8 billion in savings, so 24 net spend over 4 years. I mean, it's not a subjective analysis. It just is what it is. And as Laura said, the economy is, the economic growth forecasts have been downgraded. The government, to its credit, has embarked on a growth agenda. It may be a sort of big government growth agenda, but at least they're thinking of a way out of this in the medium to longer term. Well, but that's just the figures as they are. There's nothing historical about it.
Well, the question, Peter, is it a problem, and does more work need to be done to offset those, to find more savings?
Okay, 2 points. One is, and Phil's just touched on it in his last comment, you can't talk about this without looking at what's happening with the economic cycle. So take a step back. Were the revenue gods smiling on the government? Yes, they were. The government's collected more revenue than it has as a share of GDP since John Howard was in the Lodge. Year 2000, 2001 was the last time any government collected this much. And are they spending it? Are they making the most of it? They're spending nearly all of it. No government has spent this much as a share of GDP since Bob Hawke was in the Lodge, 1987, I think it was.
Once you take out the COVID years.
Yeah, take out the COVID years. So, that's the big picture. Now, all of that is within traditional parameters, nothing outrageous. The trick is, at the end of it, they managed to bring down a surplus for this year, and anticipating a slowdown in the economy, as Laura said. Well, what do you do if you're the federal government? Well, you allow the deficit to blow out to support activity, and that's exactly what this government's done. Have they done it outrageously? They're projecting a deficit of 1% of GDP. Not outrageous at all, very much within the norm. Overall, it's a pretty sensible picture. The longer term, if they continue running larger and growing deficits over the years to come, then it becomes a problem. At the moment, it's actually pretty well managed and pretty well contained, and that they can claim 2 surpluses in a row, which not in their 9 years that Liberals were never managed to pull off.
Since that's happened. What about just some quick thoughts on the budget reply before we hear from the Treasurer, Laura? What was Peter Dutton aiming to do with this budget reply? What does it tell us about his vision for the future?
Well, he was avoiding issues he'd previously been highlighting. There wasn't a lot there about cost of living or nuclear, and he was basically making it all about housing and migration. Housing is obviously a huge crisis issue, but to pin it all on what you're going to do about migration, particularly when none of the policies that you're proposing will actually reduce the number of people, looking for houses, I think is a pretty shoddy effort.
Well, we'll come back to the migration debate in some detail, what impact it might have. But Phil, clearly the call was made not to put out, detailed costings on nuclear or tax or any of those big things. So what do you make of what you do?
Look, the fact we're probably talking about that more than we are the budget, or as a polity, shows that, regardless of the merits or otherwise of what he announced, it had cut through, and I think that's what Dutton was aiming for. I mean, they've promised to embellish the tax cuts, but they said from the start that won't be till closer to the election, so we weren't expecting that on Thursday night. And as for the nuclear policy, who knows where that's gone.
There was an expectation we'd see something by now, but...
Well, it was before the budget. Remember they said back in March we'd announce these sites before the budget, and it's obviously become internally difficult, and leadership got a bit ahead of themselves. So I don't have any clarity on that. They keep telling us they haven't gone soft on this nuclear idea, and there will be an announcement, but he barely mentioned it on Thursday night.
Peter, how would you sum up the sort of vision from Peter Dutton?
Well, where the government is, we're heading into a slowdown. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of economic pain in the country. Where the government has tried to deal with that by generating some hope and optimism, especially with their Future Made in Australia policy, which is all about investment, growth, new industries. The opposition, Peter Dutton, has come to the same set of circumstances, the same anxiety and downturn, with maybe a characteristic of a Conservative party, pulling back from risk. No, we don't want to take any risks with new industries. We don't want to invest more in new industries. Cut back immigration. It's all about retracting. Whereas Labor is all about expanding. I would characterise that as the essential difference.
A pretty classic divide.
Yeah, it fits the personality of the parties, right?
Yeah. All right, well, we're going to come back to some of those things in quite a bit more detail. Time to talk to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, though. To take us there, here was the Opposition Leader explaining why he thinks cutting immigration will help tackle the housing crisis.
We've never had a period in history where we've brought in 1 million people when we only have 250,000 homes being built. And Australians know it. Australians aren't stupid. They can see through the weasel words of this Prime Minister, they can't find a home. We're in a very difficult situation, and nobody can pretend to you that the homes can be built overnight. So if that's the scenario, Australians need homes now. You can't build homes now in the numbers that you need. What can you do? Well, the obvious question is to look at the migration program, and that's exactly what we've done.
Treasurer, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David.
So does lowering the migration intake make housing more affordable?
Oh, I think what we saw with Peter Dutton's budget reply, David, was he hasn't thought through the impact of these numbers that he has plucked out of the air. If you think about the relationship between migration and housing, for example, of the less than 5,000 homes purchased by foreigners in the most recent data, around 1,300 of them were established homes. And so this will make nowhere near the difference that he is claiming that it will, and that's because he hasn't thought it through. Now, this is what happens when you have an opposition leader whose primary objective is to divide the community, and that will damage the economy as a consequence. His budget reply was dark, it was divisive, intentionally so, and the net effect of all of that would be that he would destroy the budget and damage the economy.
Well, just on that, just to unpack what you're saying, that this would destroy the budget and damage the economy. He is saying he wants to reduce the permanent migration intake from 185 down to 140,000, but also the net overseas migration number, which is the bigger number including permanent and temporary migrants, from 260,000 down to 160,000. What would that do to the economy and the budget?
Well, he hasn't thought through any of these numbers. He was scratching around for something to say in a budget which was completely bereft of alternatives or vision. And so he's come up with these numbers by plucking them out of the air. What he hasn't thought through is the impact, not just on the economy, but on the skills base of this country. I mean, who does he think, in addition to the workers that we will train with new money and new investments in the budget for training more builders and construction workers, but we need a sensible migration program to find the nurses and the builders and other people that we need to ensure that our economy can continue to grow into the future. And this is what happens, you know, when you've got arguably the most divisive opposition leader in memory, a budget reply which was completely bereft of cost of living help or a vision for the future, which is what the two things our budget was built on. Instead, you get these numbers plucked out of the air. It fell apart more or less on the Friday morning. Experts and industry came out to pan it, and that's because he hasn't factored in the damage that he will do to the economy.
But can you give us any measure of what that
he's
damage?
Plucked out of the air.
Can you give us any read on what that damage would be in your view?
Oh, it'll cost the economy billions of dollars, but even the kinds of estimates that you will see are conservative because it's not possible to fully capture the damage that Peter Dutton would do to the skills base of this country, to our hospitals, on our building sites, the sorts of things that he hasn't thought through. And so it will cost, his budget reply will cost the budget tens of billions of dollars. He's got at least a $40 billion hole in his budget by our estimation, but it will also cost the economy billions of dollars, and that's before you factor in the damage he's doing to the skills base that we need to build the future.
So this would cost the budget tens of billions of dollars. It prompts the question, does the budget rely on those high levels of immigration?
No, I'm saying his budget reply will cost the budget tens of billions of dollars. You know, he says he'll reinstate the old stage 3 tax cuts, which were skewed to the wealthiest Australians. They say they'll spend more on defence.
All right, well,
he announced $1 billion
to be fair, they're going to
new
announce a
spending in
tax
the budget.
policy close to the election, they say. But just on the migration issue, which we're talking about here, the budget impact of that, what would that be?
We factor in the budget impact of our decisions, not Peter Dutton's decisions. It's clear, though, what he's proposing here will cost the economy in terms of lost activity, and it will also cost dearly when it comes to the skills base.
Okay, but does that mean you're not willing to shift your own forecasts on migration, both the permanent migration number and the net overseas migration number?
Well, that's a good opportunity to remind your viewers, David, that already net overseas migration next year will be half what it was last year. And we've taken an extra 5,000 off the permanent migration program. And the difference between how we've gone about it and the numbers that Peter Dutton has plucked out of the air is that we work through these issues in a considered and a methodical way, conscious of the impact on the economy, conscious of the impact on the skills base. And because of that, we have been able to moderate the migration program that we inherited from Peter Dutton. We are seeing a really substantial winding down of net overseas migration.
And is this
over
as
the
far
next
as you
couple
can
of
go?
years.
Can you go further, or is this it?
Well, we've struck the most effective and most appropriate balance, which recognises that we need to get that net overseas migration number down and the permanent number down a little bit as well. But we can do that in a way that doesn't smash our economy and doesn't smash the skills base of our economy, which is just as important.
Is the plan that will help on the housing front?
Well, we've got a much broader, much more ambitious agenda for housing. And Peter Dutton wants to pretend that these 1,300 established dwellings purchased by foreigners in the most recent data will fix a housing pipeline.
Well, that's a part of it. He is talking about the bigger cut in permanent and net overseas migration, which was explained. But your cuts, will they help the housing crisis?
Well, we'll help the housing situation by investing an extra $6 billion in the budget as part of a $32 billion effort to build more homes for Australians, to make it easier to build and rent and buy. You know, housing was one of the big...
Will the migration change help the housing problem?
Nothing that you do in migration, nothing that you do in some of these other areas that people have been floating is a substitute for the kinds of numbers of homes that we need to build together. And that's why we've got this ambitious but achievable target of 1.2 million homes in the 5 years from July.
And I want to ask you about that, but sorry to press this, but we've heard from plenty in the government before. I'm just wondering if there's a reluctance now to say it again. Cutting migration will help in part on the housing front.
Well, we've got the changes that we're proposing to migration are about making sure that the levels are more manageable. Obviously, that has implications for housing and for infrastructure. But the point that I'm making, David, is that without building more homes, none of these other things can be substitutes for building more homes, and that's why that's our focus, one of our main focuses in the budget.
But does cutting migration help?
At the margins, at best.
Okay.
But the best way to wind down this migration program is to do it in a careful and methodical way. And I don't think you can describe what Peter Dutton is proposing as either considered or methodical.
So the target to build 1.2 million new homes by the end of the decade that you mentioned, we saw in the budget that the last financial year dwelling investment fell. Same this year. Next year it's set to remain flat. How confident are you about hitting that target?
Well, the housing pipeline's really concerning, and that's why we're investing billions of dollars in new funding in building more homes for Australians. And in doing that, we've shown a willingness to invest quite substantially. We're working closely with the states and territories and local governments. And we're also training more workers to build the homes that we will need in our communities. And on top of that, we're building the infrastructure which is necessary to connect those communities up as well. So a very broad, very comprehensive, methodical and considered plan for housing and for infrastructure to make sure that we can build the homes that people need because rents are too high. The construction pipeline is not what we need it to be, and that's why we are investing so substantially and so enthusiastically in trying to turn that around.
Will you hit the target?
That's our intention, David, but it's ambitious. You know, I understand that it's a big, ambitious target, but it's achievable if everybody does their bit, and we've shown in the budget that we'll be doing our bit.
Let's talk about spending in the budget. The budget increases net spending by a further $24 billion over the next 4 years. As a percentage of GDP, spending rises to its highest level for a non-COVID year since 1986. Is all of this spending really unavoidable?
Well, certainly when you look at the spending next year, which is responsible for those net policy decisions that you describe, you know, we're talking here about things like making sure that MyGov continues to be funded, making sure that health programs are extended, plus the cost of living relief that we are providing for people. And so I think any objective observer of the sorts of investments that we are making in those areas would conclude that is unavoidable spending. But David, I've got to say I'm really grateful for the quite sophisticated conversation on the couch a few moments ago, which recognised the really substantial progress that we have been making when it comes to budget repair. You know, we have been turning big Liberal deficits into Labor surpluses. Even the deficit next year is $19 billion smaller than what we inherited. We've been banking most of the upward revisions to revenue. We saved $150 billion worth of debt this year. We're saving $80 billion in debt interest costs. Real spending growth is a fraction of what we've seen in the last 30 years. And all of this means that we're getting the budget in much better nick so that we can fund cost of living relief and invest in the future.
But it is growing, and yes, many of the things you mentioned there are no doubt difficult to avoid. But what about a big one, and that's the GST deal with Western Australia? It's now going to cost nearly $53 billion over the next 10 years. Can you really sit here and say that's unavoidable spending?
Well, that's the deal that we're committed to, and yes, it's expensive. And I think that's a reminder to all of the other states that the Commonwealth has been willing to top up their GST allocations to make sure that they're not worse off from the deal that was done with Western Australia. We're committed to that deal.
WA is the richest state. It's got surpluses, I think, as far as the eye can see in their own budgets. You're about to go back into deficit. How is this responsible?
Well, it's responsible because we made the commitment, and we want to make sure that Western Australia, which is such a driver, such an important contributor to our national prosperity, gets their fair share of the GST. I say that on the West Coast, and I say it on the East Coast as well.
But can you also say to those who wanted some spending on domestic violence supports, an increase in job seeker, can you sit here and say, no, WA was more important?
Well, first of all, it doesn't come at the expense of helping people with the cost of living. It doesn't help with it doesn't come at the expense of strengthening Medicare and all of these other things that we're doing, investing in housing. But it's a deal that was struck, it's a deal that we're committed to, and that figure that you cite is a reminder to all of the other states that the Commonwealth has stepped in to make sure that they're not worse off.
All right, on the energy bill relief, $300 to every household. Should the Fair Work Commission factor in that and your other cost of living measures in its minimum wage decision?
We want to see decent wages for people in addition to, not instead of, easing their cost of living pressures. You know, the cost of living package in the budget was substantial and responsible and additional to the decent wage outcomes that we want to see for all workers, but especially for people on the lowest incomes. And so we designed the cost of living package to supplement decent wages, not supplant them. We want to see a decent pay increase for minimum wage workers on top of the government's efforts to ease people's cost of living.
Right. Would you like to see the minimum wage rise higher than inflation this year?
Our view is consistent with the submission that we've already submitted, and you and I have probably spoken about this in the past. We don't want to see people go backwards. We know that people are under cost of living pressure up and down the income scale, but particularly people on low and fixed incomes. We don't want to see them go backwards. The government is doing its bit, providing substantial but responsible cost of living help, and we want to see a decent pay increase on top of that. If you think about the government's motives here, ease cost of living, help people to earn more and also to keep more of what they earn with a tax cut for every taxpayer. Those are our objectives, and the Fair Work Commission's got a role to play there.
Let's talk about your future Made in Australia plans. Nearly $14 billion in tax credits for processing critical minerals and producing green hydrogen. What do you expect you'll get, or the nation will get, for that investment? Has there been any work done on what the likely return is meant to be?
Yeah, there has been some. And I think your question is a good reminder that the bulk of the $23 billion or so over the decade that we're investing to attract private capital into a future made in Australia is overwhelmingly tax concessions, tax breaks to encourage this kind of investment. And the most advanced calculations and modelling that we have done is for the renewable hydrogen production tax credit. And so for that $6.7 billion, we expect to leverage around $50 billion in private investment. So about $7.50 for every dollar of Commonwealth tax breaks provided. And that gives you a good indication of our objective here, which is to attract more private capital into a future made in Australia, to make ourselves an indispensable part of the global net zero transformation, so that our industries and our workers and our communities are the big beneficiaries of these shifts that are underway around the world.
If new gas fields are opened up under your gas strategy, will that make green hydrogen less viable?
I don't believe so. I think it's very clear that gas has a role to play, even as we engage and invest substantially and enthusiastically in more renewable power. You know, the focus of the budget was on renewable energy, becoming a renewable energy superpower, billions of dollars of investment to leverage multiples of that in the private market. And we are very confident that renewable hydrogen has a big role to play in our industrial base, but also in our export offering. And the same goes for refining and processing critical minerals and other opportunities.
Look, the tax credits for hydrogen and critical minerals, as you say, it's sort of pay on delivery. You've got to produce it before you get the benefit. Why aren't you using that same approach when it comes to solar panel and battery making in Australia? You're giving them, it's $1.5 billion up front. Why the different approach there?
Well, different opportunities are at different stages and they require different levels of investment. And the investment in whether it's batteries or clean manufacturing in other ways, clean energy manufacturing, sometimes the assistance is best provided for innovation at the front end. Sometimes it's best provided as a production tax credit, as you rightly point out. And so for some of these other opportunities, using really robust frameworks and bodies like ARENA and other investment vehicles, that support is best provided at the innovation stage rather than at the production stage.
When it comes to making solar panels and batteries, it's heavily concentrated in China, as we know. But as your own Treasury Department points out, plenty of other countries are getting into this space to break that concentration. Europe, the US, Canada, France, India. These are friends, they're allies. As Treasury says, accessing cheap solar panels from offshore supports Australia's ambition to become a renewable energy superpower. Treasury's not saying that we need to make them here, is it?
Well, first of all, I've never said that we are trying to make 100% of the world's solar panels here, and it makes a lot of sense that our friends around the world are getting into this market as well, because they share our concern that the supply and the production of solar panels is far too concentrated in one country, in this case China. And if you think about that Treasury paper that we released with the budget, the National Interest Framework, there's a big emphasis there on resilience and security and making sure that we're dealing with our vulnerabilities. And one of our vulnerabilities is the way that these supply chains have been too concentrated. And so we're not pretending we're going to make every single thing here. We're not pretending we are necessarily going to replace the scale of some other big economies. What we are saying here is that whether it's solar or some of these other opportunities, there is a chance here for us to make ourselves more resilient, and part of making ourselves more resilient is dealing with those vulnerabilities in the supply chain and playing a role there.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers, appreciate you joining us after a busy budget week. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David.
Well, coming up, we're going to talk more about this Future Made in Australia plan. There is now a political divide over the tax credits and subsidies the government's put on offer. How will the politics of that play? First, let's continue this conversation. Back to our panel, Laura Tingle, Phil Coorey and Peter Hartcher. I want to come back to that migration debate. Firstly, Laura, we heard from the Treasurer there that this will destroy the budget, were his words, I think, and was it devastate the economy? Not specific numbers, but clearly the view from the government and I assume from Treasury is that this would hurt.
Well, yes, and of course one of the interesting things here is that the government has been cutting back the numbers, and so in some ways you could say, well, all Peter Dutton is doing more of it. But I think the crucial point here is that Peter Dutton is been picking various numbers and changing his story on what he's actually aiming for. But as far as I can understand it now, he's talking about cutting net overseas migration.
Well, let me just show this to you, right? Just because there are a bunch of numbers here, it can get confusing. So this is the permanent migration number. This is what he talked about on the budget reply speech. On the left there is this current year's permanent migration intake. The yellow part is the skilled component of that, and the top is family reunion. The middle column there is what Labor is forecasting for next year. So it comes down the permanent migration intake, but not by much. And then on the right is what Peter Dutton is saying, and that's bringing that permanent number down under the coalition to a smaller number of 140,000. But net overseas migration is the bigger figure. It includes permanent and temporary, and there's been this big post-COVID spike in temporary students coming and so on. On the left there, the yellow one, that shows us this current financial year, net overseas migration coming in at just under 400,000. Labor says next year it'll be 260,000. They'll get it down to 260,000. But Peter Dutton, in those interviews he did the morning after his budget reply, started saying he'd be able to get that number down to 160,000. 100,000.
So that he's talking about an extra 100,000 people not coming to Australia. Now, he hasn't said how he's going to actually achieve that. The only real vehicles to do that are via overseas student numbers and, dare one say, working visas of people who might work on farms. He hasn't actually...
They're saying, I checked with them as to whether this was a mistake that and they said, no, this is part of the plan. Okay. And they're saying, look, not interested in touching the backpackers. And I think the Nats have some pretty strong views. They don't want to touch the backpackers and they wouldn't touch tourists. So it almost has to be just students. So it has to be students.
Now, in economic terms, that has a huge implication. I mean, massive. I mean, the government is already talking about cutting the number of overseas students. Let's just think about the trajectory here. We threw a whole heap of them out for the pandemic. Scott Morrison then announced that students could get could basically work whatever hours they wanted to in an effort to encourage them back in. As a result, we got a huge surge in student numbers and other visa holders. That started to ease off because the government put a cap on those working requirements.
So you can only work 20 hours, I think it is, a week.
That's right. And let's face it, it's about working here. It's not necessarily about studying here that is driving this as a pull factor. Now, if Peter Dutton's going to cut that by 100,000, it means a lot less workers, a lot less people in the economy. Now, he might say that that has a positive impact on housing, but it doesn't necessarily have as big an impact as you would think it would because... essentially, the number of people coming here and sort of sitting here on temporary visas doesn't necessarily fall. It just doesn't.
Well, a lot of those, I think, 70% of those who win a permanent visa are already here on a temporary visa. Phil,
we saw that after COVID when there was those giant labour shortages. Because all the students hadn't come back yet. Remember, cafes couldn't open and things like that. So this would if he were to cut students by that amount, that would be one side effect of this. Chalmers is interesting because Labor, as Laura said, is proposing to cap students, but not like the Canadians did with a hard cap. So this is how many we're going to have, but to cap the number each institution could have. So
this university can have that many.
Yeah, both sides recognise it's a problem, and the numbers have to be brought down, but it's how you do it. Now, Chalmers, during the budget process, there were calls to follow the Canadians and put on a hard cap. He said no, after commodities, international students are our largest exports. Commodities aren't going so great at the moment, and may run, the way it's going with climate change and stuff. So you've got to do this in a way that doesn't damage the industry for the long term to fix a short-term political problem. Yeah. So that's Labor did it in a more nuanced fashion.
So look, but the pitch from Peter Dutton is a pretty simple one. We're going to go harder in cutting immigration, and here's what he says: it's going to help fix the housing problem.
My decision is to prioritise Australians for housing in our country because we've got people living in tents, we've got people living in cars. I want to see them in housing.
That sounds fair enough, Peter, but when you do get to the detail of, well, who are you going to stop coming, there's a list of skilled workers that come in under the permanent migration program. Nurses and midwives at the top. I mean, no one's going to say, aged care workers. Then you've got a lot of teachers coming in, yes, IT specialists, accountants. Liberals say, well, we probably have too many accountants coming in, but there's a lot on that list they wouldn't want to touch.
Well, it's turned into a Dutch auction between the two parties, hasn't it? With Labor saying, we realise it's been overcooked and we're going to bring the numbers way back because and this is really a big issue in the community. Dutton said, okay, but I've got to go further than you guys have gone. Exactly. Now, what you've just touched on is the Achilles heel, or one of the Achilles. I don't know how many heels did Achilles have, but
one that mattered.
Yeah, one that mattered, and there are. In the permanent migration intake, he has said that they're going to cut 45,000 of those positions. Now, of those, about 30 are skilled, and that's the category you're talking about. So, as you say, do we think Australia has too many nurses? I don't think so. Do we think it has too many teachers? I don't think so. Too many IT workers, construction workers. So, unless he's talking about the onus really now is on the opposition to explain how they're going to do that without damaging the skills base that the country needs. He needs to tidy that up. And the rest of the permanent intake he said that he'll cut is the 15,000, the remaining 15,000 of the permanent intake. That's family visas. Now, that's a gift to Labor. If they can go to an election saying the opposition is going to even further delay
Well,
your reunion with your grandma.
You look at the diaspora communities and the influence they're having in a lot of marginal seats at the moment. That's going to be tricky.
Yes.
But this bigger number of net overseas migration and really crushing the number of international students that come in, Phil, how's that likely to play? I mean, is that easier for the Libs to go after students, or will the university say this is this is our second biggest export?
In sort of broad politics, they're pushing buttons here, right, aren't they? And when people read there's 700,000 foreign students in Australia at the moment, they go, "Wow, where are they all going to live?" You know, this sort of thing. It's even Labor, as I said, they're telling the universities. There's 1,400 institutions in this country which enrol foreign students, and each of them is going to have a cap imposed on them. And if you want to go above that cap, you've got to build more housing for them. So, as Peter said, they're both reacting to the same problem and the same political pressure point. It's just how subtle or unsubtle you are about it. But you know, if Peter Dutton were to, net overseas migration, the greatest feeder of that is foreign students, and if he were to pare that back like that, it would be a big financial problem for the universities, and they've become utterly dependent on this for income.
And it would
ever since governments of both political stripes of Labor and Liberal have cut university funding over recent decades. They've just lent on foreign students for money, and they've become degree factories to an extent. The whole business model is now built on this.
And it's also the case that the economy has basically been kept its head above water because of migration. So suddenly we're deciding, we don't want this at a time when the economy is still, barely.
But a lot of people resent that, don't they? You listen to any focus group, you listen to any talkback radio, you'll hear concern about migration, concern that the budget's propped up by it.
You will, but I think what was concerning is for a political leader to come out and say not only is housing the fault of migrants, but you can't get a childcare space, you can't get through the traffic on the roads, you can't get in to see the doctor because of migration. That is lighting this thing up in a really disturbing way, regardless of the arguments about whether there should be more or less migration, regardless of whether his policies make sense, and I would say that they don't make coherent sense in what he's put out in his budget reply. The hot buttons he's pressing there, I think, are very dangerous for our community.
Let's come back to the budget itself and the inflation question, which I think everyone agrees is the big test. What happens to inflation from here? A lot of debate. Well, this $300 electricity bill rebate to everyone. Firstly, not means testing it. They did last year. Everyone gets it this year. Peter, we saw quite a bit of debate around that the day after the budget. Is the explanation fair enough that it was just too difficult?
Well, so you've got, on the one hand, you've got the government showing a Treasury forecast saying it's going to bring inflation down. On the other, you've got the economists saying, no, it won't. I think the truth there is in between, that all it does really by handing out the $300 as a rebate instead of giving you cash is it means you're going to get $75 a quarter. Is that going to make you feel richer? Are you going to finally take that 3-month world trip that you had long been putting off? Because I
think the aspirations of many households are somewhat lower than that. But.
Yeah, precisely. So it doesn't make people feel rich. If people are having trouble paying the bills, they're not going to rush out and splurge. I think it neutralises the effect of giving everybody money, cash, giving it as a rebate, and it neutralises the Reserve Bank's thinking on this. Is that this is a really marginal question, and it's probably a wash and probably has no real impact on inflation.
Yeah, what do you think? Bill, plenty of economists were saying it's a trick. It's
the reason they didn't means test it. I mean, it is difficult to means test when they did the federal ones last year. Some states did and some didn't. It's very difficult. So, but it's a convenient excuse because it allows them then to spend $3 billion in a pretty crude fashion to try and lower the measured inflation rate.
It's a very simple political line. Everyone gets the tax cut. Everyone gets the.
Whether the RBA falls for it is another question. It's a bit like two blokes turn up in the Melbourne Cup dressed in a horse suit and try and sneak in and just, to the steward say, hold on, we're not falling for that. We'll know, I think, in June when the Reserve Bank next issues its forecasts, which are at the moment a lot higher than what the budget is forecasting. So It was a pretty crude exercise. I don't think we should overanalyse it, and you can sell it off as everyone gets a bit.
Well, the fact that they can now have that simple line, as I say, you're all getting a tax cut, you're all getting this energy bill, $300. It had some wondering immediately after the budget, well, what might we be heading to an election sometime a little later this year rather than next year? Check out this exchange with the Treasurer on 6PR.
The Prime Minister didn't really rule out the chance of an early election off this budget this morning. He sort of danced around it a bit. Will you rule out an early election?
Well, the funny thing about that is he's just actually walked into my office to say good day and to check in.
So can you just ask him in case he didn't get the right question last time?
Hey, Albo, they want to know from 6PR when's the election going to be. But he's just wandered in to say good day. He said, when do you want it?
I reckon after May's good.
Can't be after May. It has to be sometime before then. I don't know if we want to get into a guessing game on when the election will be.
All we can say is what they need is the Reserve Bank to cut rates. Now, there's a risk that won't happen, which we're all underplaying here, but there's a risk that won't happen. But presuming that it's going to happen, I can't believe that it's going to happen any time before December. If for no other reason than the Reserve Bank is going to want to make sure that it looks credible when it's doing it and want some other inflation numbers in there. So I don't know what the definition of an early election is, but I'm thinking January or February next year isn't very early.
It's not terribly early. Anyway, look, we'll see. We can start getting that crystal ball out once a rate cut comes. The Future Made in Australia plans. Peter, we've been waiting to see detail in the budget. We do see a bit more flesh on the bones of what this is going to mean, tax credits for critical minerals processing, hydrogen, a few other details in that supporting paper we were talking about with the Treasurer. How does it shape up now, do you think?
I think it's broadly Australia is joining the West in recognising that China has been playing the winning game for the last 40 years. And the West has now said, well, the pandemic showed us your industry policy has worked. You've got your monopoly or near monopoly on all of the stuff we're going to need for the renewable energy transition and various other things as well. And we've got to join we've got to catch up. We've got to join this game. And so the US led it, of course, with the Inflation Reduction Act plus the CHIPS Act and various other spending. Massive spending, massive outlays.
I mean, ours is a drop in the bucket.
Ours is a drop in the bucket. But the question is, so the International Energy Agency has estimated that the total investment required to conduct the renewable energy transition over the next 20, 30 years will be $200 trillion US dollars.
I can't even understand that.
Right.
Sort of number.
So the one way of conceiving that is it's the total output of the global economy, 2 years running. 2 whole years. It's massive. So
Australia needs.
The question is, does Australia join that competition or not?
Or do we pick our lane or pick the areas where we want to focus?
Yes.
Critical minerals processing.
Yes.
Hydrogen. Treasury's saying, yep.
That's exactly what this budget does.
But do we also need to pick the solar panel making lane as well?
No, it's a discretionary extra. Likewise, the government, together with the Queensland government, have put nearly $1 billion into a quantum computing venture. Now, these are optional extras, and they're direct handouts as grants, equity, or loans, rather than tax concessions on production.
I'm interested
in two separate categories.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good explanation of what's happening and why. As to the politics of this, I was fascinated that Peter Dutton in his budget reply made it very clear he's not only opposed to these the measures, but it sounds like any support for these critical minerals and hydrogen industries at all.
We will not spend $13.7 billion on corporate welfare for green hydrogen and critical minerals. Yeah. These projects should stand up on their own without the need for taxpayers' money if they're worth the investment.
I mean, the Morrison government supported both of these industries. Scott Morrison said, we cannot pretend the world is not changing. They had various hydrogen hubs and critical minerals facilities and so on. Phil, what do you make of this line?
Couple of things behind it. First, they believe it. They don't think the mining industry needs that sort of hand up. It's about getting back to basics with politics for Dutton. He sees the best way to help those guys is to unravel some of Labor's industrial relations changes, which, to be honest, the miners would say they'd much rather have than a tax credit. Especially companies like BHP and stuff said, look, we can we'll have a better chance staying viable in nickel if you remove the labour hire restrictions and things like that, rather than give us a tax credit. So Dutton it's about bringing it back to basics. Secondly, the coalition, we're going to an election, they need money. They need their own money to fund some of their own promises, including that tax cut. The
building
flag,
nuclear.
Well, I don't think there's enough around for that. But so it's about starting to oppose things so they can start banking a little bit of stuff to spend on their own priorities. But
problem is in the West,
there's a risk involved.
The Libs locally are all in favour of this.
They are all in favour of this, but it is basically still a bit of a nebulous idea, I think, and that's the way it's being fought. As Phil says, Peter Dutton's pushing it back to basics. The government's basically saying, we want to build stuff, and there are really good reasons for doing that. But somebody very senior in the government said to me over the weekend that, in their polling, the responses to the budget showed that the messages people had got up was $300, we're getting a tax cut, and we're going to, excuse the French, make shit in Australia. And that's all they really want to know. But it is that sort of vision thing of, that Dutton is going to try to push the idea that Labor is for big government.
A couple of other things just quickly. Another example of the pressure the Prime Minister's under when it comes to the war in Gaza. Fatima Payman, a Labor senator from Western Australia, spoke out and really took it at odds with what Anthony Albanese's been saying.
Today, more than ever, is the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, with courage and clarity. My conscience has been uneasy for far too long, and I must call this out for what it is. This is a genocide. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
And the Prime Minister had to again state his opposition to that line. He says it's inappropriate. Laura, how is he managing the tensions on this?
You mean about the senator in particular or in general?
No, well, this week is an example of where some, at least in his ranks, want a more forthright pro-Palestinian position. Yeah,
look, I think that the Prime Minister's continued to be incredibly cautious about this. I think the government has actually had terrible trouble trying to work out what the correct line is. But the sorts of tensions we're seeing in the caucus are basically the same tensions that are in the community. We've got two groups in the community who feel very passionate about this and who feel like they're not being heard. And trying to manage that, I think, does require a little bit more courage than the government's been prepared to demonstrate. But I think her comments about from the river to the sea are obviously pretty incendiary and are very difficult for him to work on, what he does about that.
Yeah, and we saw those scenes yesterday at the Labor conference in Melbourne as well, where certainly Labor is generally under a fair bit of pressure on this. Now, our panel, Peter Hartcher, Phil Coorey and Laura Tingle, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with photographer for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Alex Ellinghausen, and a very warm budget day welcome, although it's quite cold out here under the budget tree.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Alex, this is your favourite time of the year, that is when the budget's over for another year, but can I burst your bubble because the Prime Minister this week told us the next budget will be March, so it's less than a year away.
I'll worry about it next year.
Alex, there's certainly a theatrical element to what they bowl up for us for visuals, isn't there? But on the actual day itself, the visuals they bowl up is sort of the Treasurer arriving at Parliament, and this is your picture of him, and you've got that iconic flagpole in the background, the Treasurer arriving. It kind of says it all.
He's got a very recognisable silhouette. You can tell he's got the budget book in his hand as well.
It's almost cartoonish because his ears are sort of backlit. This is Lucas's picture of the water framed between it.
Does the Fountain go every year?
No, sometimes they turn it off.
Yeah.
Lucas is very taken with the belts on the bollards.
Well, there's one thing that Parliament is definitely not in deficit of, and that's bollards. there's a huge surplus.
There's a surplus of bullets. So after they're finished going and selling their budget through the press gallery, they go and do the press conference in the lockup. I use a flash in those press conferences to sort of isolate and exaggerate the subjects. Do you use that technique?
Oh, every once in a while. It depends on how messy the background is.
The worst is the unused TV tripod.
Oh, if I had $1 for every time I had that in a photo.
Basically, we're photographing people in suits at lecterns. The cartoonist can draw these really complicated issues into one condensed, quite beautiful piece of art usually. Let's have a look at some of the front pages. Mr. Shakespeare has done the dragon, and Jim here trying to tame him with a little teeny fork.
I'm not an expert on medieval weaponry, but I don't think this pitchfork's really going to do the trick.
No, I don't think it's going to do the trick either. Johannes Leek on the Australian. He does, in a cartoon sense, what we do when we try to light things or silhouette things. It's isolate and exaggerate the ears and the smile, which are kind of the quintessential Jim Chalmers, isn't it?
Yeah.
Don Lindsay at the West Australian has used the twister board, which is a nice slant on it, money spinner, and a very nice depiction of Mr. Chalmers there. So then the lockup ends at 7:30 when as soon as the speech hits the dispatch box and the Treasurer starts to speak, the lockup's lifted. You were already out, so you were in there, but I had to race out. And in comes the Prime Minister usually. What are you looking for during the speech?
It's usually that early on period when they come in the room, who they speak to, who they're chatting with, who they come with, but also that couple of moments before that big speech.
Yeah.
And the Treasurer did come in with his family.
Yeah, Laura and
Annabelle
and Leo were here.
You know, as parents, if we got to turn up to their school concerts and plays, they should come to our big day.
I've always found that really the whole day comes down to that final bit where the Prime Minister slaps on the back, shakes the hand or hugs them. The next day we move on budget plus one, we call it.
Yeah, there's a huge buzz on the morning after the budget. The courtyard is full. You get the Treasurer, you get the Prime Minister, you get the Opposition Leader, you know, zigzagging between the different networks.
At one point the Treasurer snuck up on the Prime Minister, who was talking to Michael Rowland on ABC.
Yep.
News Breakfast.
Photo bomb.
I did love this Matt Golding cartoon. Gina Reinhardt expects her rebate. Everyone gets a rebate. The rich, the poor, everyone. And she's inspecting her rebate with a microscope here.
That's small.
There it is. That's small. Later in the week we move on and it's the Leader of the Opposition's chance to be appalled at what the government has done, and I can do much better. The opposition front bench sort of applauding with the Leader acknowledging.
And the wave.
Yeah. After the speech, family members are hugged, front benches are hugged. It's been a great pleasure unpicking the events of this very busy week, and I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks for having me, Mike, and back to you, David.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mike, and terrific work, all the photographers during Budget Week. Time for some final observations. Peter.
Well, I'd just like to shout out a birthday on Wednesday. It's the birthday of Australia's first compulsory election. Compulsory voting was introduced in Australia 109 years ago on Wednesday. It was a Queensland state election and, you know, an Australian innovation politically, and in a time when world politics is going slightly mad, Australian politics has stayed broadly sane, and that's had a lot to do with compulsory voting.
We should treasure it. I like that.
Absolutely.
I thought you were going to say Tuesday's the second anniversary of the Albanese government's election, but there you go. I like that one a little more. Phil.
I can think of no worse job in this country or position in this country other than to be a spouse or a partner of a politician. And we saw again this week that pile-on Laura Chalmers because she happened to put on a nice dress for budget night. You know, she's a professional woman in her own right. She's a wonderful person. She does the lion's share of the family as, you know, the husband's away. She looks good for one night and there's a pile on. I thought it just demeaned us. And, we really got to be bigger than that.
Yeah, well said, Phil. Laura.
Housing. For those who are interested in what's going on in the housing market, could I commend a speech by Sarah Hunter, the Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, Brackets Economics, on Thursday, who looked at the demand and supply picture in the housing sector. Really interesting. There's a whole, basically she says there's a perfect storm which explains why, despite this sudden rush in population, we haven't seen the demand response. A lot of factors in that. One of them is that we don't want to live with as many people as we used to. She says that if we lived in the same depth of, in the same concentration as we did in the mid-80s, we'd need 1.2 million less houses. But she also points out that interest rates don't just affect buyers, they affect builders. And at the moment, costs just don't make sense to encourage builders to be out there building, whatever happens to the population.
No quick fix, I think, is what she said. Look, thank you all very much for joining us after a big week. Finally, you might have seen Donald Trump giving Scott Morrison a very warm reception during the week. There they were. But look, that's nothing compared to his fondness for the fictional serial killer Hannibal Lecter. We'll leave you with this somewhat bizarre departure from the script by Donald Trump that left many scratching their heads. Thanks for watching.
The late, great Hannibal Lecter was a wonderful man. He oftentimes would have a friend for dinner. Remember the last scene? Excuse me, I'm about to have a friend for dinner. Poor doctor. I'm about to have a friend for dinner, but Hannibal Lecter. Congratulations, the late, great Hannibal Lecter. Bye.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.